Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of December. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And today we're going to start with one of the most important update for today. And I'm talking about Yakovlevka, a small town, small village that is a part of Charlie Group. I remind you that Charlie Group is the towns that located on the line Sporne, Berestova, Belogorovka, Yakovlevka. As you can see, according to this map, Berestova was taken maybe a few months ago. Belogorovka was taken, I believe that previous week we got report about the final control over this area. And today we got the first confirmation of the fact that Yakovlevka was taken by Wagners. The Russians reported that they entered this town, they forced Ukrainians to leave this area, they established some kind of control, but during these hours they are doing some kind of clearing operation. And of course there is still a risk and there are still high chances that Ukrainians are able to make some kind of counteroffensive operation in this area and to force the Russians to step back. But anyway, today, on the 7th of December, we got the first confirmation of that fact that this town was taken by the Russians. If you remember, the Russians started clashes or battle for Yakovlevka maybe in May, right after, as soon as Popasna flower bloomed, the Russians developed their bridgehead in this area and they started the battle for Yakovlevka. So I believe that this is the one of the longest battle during this special operation. It was very difficult to cross for the Russians this road rocade, this one, and the Ukrainians were on the highland and they were attacking the Russians every time they tried to do something in this area. But today Yakovlevka have fallen. Let's take a look at the Western sources map. As you can see, there are a lot of differences with the Russian sources map, and the most important is that according to the Western sources map, Belogorovka, Nagorno, Yakovlevka, part of Berestova is still under Ukrainian control. But if we take a look at the Russian sources map, there we got the first confirmation of Yakovlevka. Belogorovka is under Russian control, and Berestova is under the Russians as well. So let's update this map approximately, softly, about the approximate control of the Russians in this area. So according to the Russian sources, we may say that the Russians control this area. Yakovlevka, Belogorovka, Berestova. And this is a very critical and bad situation for the Ukrainians, and mainly is that I believe that in a day or in two, as soon as the Russians will be able to establish a real fortification, a real position in Yakovlevka, of course the Ukrainians will make few attempts of counteroffensive operation. The Russians need to repulse them all, and I believe that in a day or two, if the Russians are able to hold this area the next 2 or 3 days, then they will be able to start development of their own offensive operation in direction of Veselaya. This small village, I don't think that it will be a very big problem for the Russians to take this town, because we can say that there are no roads that leads to this town. There was just one road that Ukrainians have from Yakovlevka. This is the only road. There are a lot of local roads. I'm not sure about the quality of this road during this period of a year. Maybe it's possible to use, maybe it is not possible, it's impossible, but anyway, Veselaya is the next town that the Russians will try to take control over. And as soon as the Russians got control over Veselaya, and then they will need to hold this area for the next few days, and after that the Russians will be able to start development of their offensive operation in direction of this small town Razdolovka, that located between Solidar, Bakhmut and Seversk. And the main and focal point in this battle, in this offensive operation that the Russians do these days, is to take control, or at least to get as close as possible to Razdolovka and to cut the roads that connects Seversk and Solidar, just to penetrate this area and to cut Seversk forces from the mainland. If we're talking about Seversk, of course, this is not the only one road that Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support these forces located in Seversk. If we take a look at deployment map, we see that there are still a lot of forces in Seversk. There are some kind of mechanized brigade, there are territorial defense, there are artillery, There are 10th Mountain Assault Brigade that located near Sporne. There are Assault Battalion Donbass. There are a lot of forces that supply and support the offensive operation of the Ukrainians, who tries to develop their offensive operation near Liman. And if the Russians are able to do this, I'm not saying that they're able to do this the next day or tomorrow. I believe that it will take around 2 or 3 weeks while the Russians will be able to establish fire control, a real dangerous fire control over the roads, these crosses, over the railroad, over the road that connects Fyodorovka with, let's say, Solidar, over this area. 3 weeks. I don't think that it will take longer, because as you can see, they're just small village and it's not a big deal to take control over it. Of course, the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians' offensive, but in this case, they will have to send a lot of infantry using these fields to stop the Russians on this town. If they don't do this, they will loot this village even faster. Another important thing, that from now on the Russians using these small trees, green lines. If you take a look at this map, I'm talking about these forests, these brushes, as you can see. All of them are completely trenched and fortified by the Ukrainians, but from now on the Russians are able to move along these lines as well. And they will do this the next days. As soon as they will be able to hold this position in Yakovlevka, they will try to develop as far as possible from the mainland, and from these positions the Russians will try to attack Solidar from the north, from this area, and of course try to attack, let's say, Krasnopopovka from this area as well. So they will now we have a local collapse of the front line in this area. The Ukrainians don't have a real powerful back in this area. Solidar, or this part of Solidar, is completely reduced to ruins. So I believe that on this front line we're going to see some development during the next few days or few weeks, and by the end of this year I believe that this picture will be changed one more time in Russian favor. Furthermore, there are still heavy clashes around Sporne, Ivano-Daryevka, but as soon as the Russians got control over Yakovlevka, it became more and more difficult to hold these positions, and I believe that these days we are also going to see a collapse of Sporne as well, and the Russians will be able to develop their bridgehead and their situation on the ground in their favor in direction of Seversk. If we are talking about Liman front line, today we got very interesting updates that during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians lost around 130 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles. But the most important thing, that all those losses the Ukrainians got not during their own offensive operation in direction of Kremenaya, Chervonopopovka and so on, Krasnoyarska and so on. The Ukrainians got these losses during the Russians' counter-offensive operation, and some sources are saying that the Russians managed to move a little bit. They got control. They developed their bridgehead for more than 4 kilometers in this area, and now the Russians is the party who attacks in this area. And I understand that this might be some kind of a part of the same story that we see these hours on this bridgehead. We will back to this situation a little bit later. If we are talking about Kupyansk front line, there are not much updates. The same stories. The Ukrainians were trying to attack in the same direction of Kuzyumovka, Novosilovska. The Russians repulsed all those attacks, and the Ukrainians lost around 70 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and around 2 artillery systems. But the front line, if we're talking about this area, is completely stable without any progress for both parties. Just the battles between armies, artillery duels, and for now, as I understand, everything goes in Russian favor. If we're talking about Bakhmut, today we got a lot of very interesting updates. Every single hour we got more and more pictures, video confirmation about the Ukrainian losses in this area. Starting from today, I believe some sources start saying that the Ukrainian losses per day is around from 200 till 1,000 soldiers per day. It might be complete speculation, of course. You know that fear has a very wide eyes, but anyway, these numbers show the direction that we need to think about. So the losses are very high, and the Russians are saying that these days they were mainly fighting with the foreign soldiers. The Russians reported that they heard a lot of English language, a lot of German language. Of course, there are a lot of soldiers from Poland, so there are a lot of volunteers from the Western countries near Bakhmut, a lot of. And if we're talking about this area, we can say that it's not even the battles or clashes between Ukrainian army and Russian army. It's mainly the battles between the Russians, mercenaries, volunteers, and army, and let's say people who from the Western countries, from the NATO countries, and of course there are a lot of Ukrainians as well. And if we're talking about this area, today we got also a lot of interesting updates, and mainly I'm talking about the areas around Kurdyumovka. If you listen to the report of Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, they reported that during the previous 24 hours they repulsed attacks, Russian attacks near Bilogora. As you can see, this town is very far from the Russians' position. So some sources, some Western sources and Russian sources reported that now the Russians crossed this canal and this water arcade, let's say, and establish real control over this small position. And as you can see, there are no buildings or something like this. I believe this area used to be under Ukrainians, and there are some trenches and so on. But from this bridgehead, the Russians were trying to develop some offensive operation in direction of Bilogora, just to push them, just to force them to step back a little bit. And of course, we understand that the main idea is to take control over these towns like Dilievka and Bilogora. But for now, the front line and the trenches moves along this area, and I'm not sure that it's an easy job. There are still very heavy clashes in the area between Mayorsk, this Mayor station, and Druzhba. So the Russians attacks in this area trying to develop and to take control over this small block or small village by the name of Druzhba. If we're talking about Donetsk front line, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 40 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles in this area. If we are talking about Donetsk, today, since the morning, we got more updates about the shelling and about casualties in Donetsk. The Ukrainians don't stop; they attack this town heavily. If we're talking about the front lines near Peski, the situation is stable, no progress from both sides. The Ukrainians, there is still some regular artillery duels and so on. Some pieces of information are coming from Marinka. There are still heavy clashes in central part, but the Russians are saying that during the next week, or let's say by the end of the next weeks, the Russians are planning, and they see this, that they will be able to take control over the central and the north part of Marinka. So by the end of the next week, the Russians are planning to develop their bridgehead in Marinka, something like this. So, and they see this progress, and they see that, according to their words, that it's possible to do. So we'll see and follow this situation. There are still heavy clashes around Novomikhailivka without any progress, and the Ukrainians made few counter-offensive operations near Ugledar in direction of Novodaryevka and in direction of Solotka near Novomikhailivka. As a result of heavy clashes on the South Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the front lines are stable, but there are very heavy clashes all along the front line, and there is just one local progress near on the north of Solidar, and small progress, let's say, near Kurdyumovka, where the Russians are trying to develop their offensive operation in the south of Bakhmut in direction of Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. And these two updates are very important. They are not very big, this progress is very small, but if we compare the Russian tactics and the Ukrainian tactics, you might see, and I believe you mentioned that if we're talking about the Ukrainians, they try to choose one certain direction. Let's say they choose Kharkiv area, they moved a lot of forces there, and they completely concentrated over this part of territory, and they concentrated all their activities, all their attention to this area, and as a result they achieved some success on the east side of Kharkiv. Then they concentrated completely on the south of Kherson district. In Kherson district they moved a lot of forces, a lot of artilleries, they paid all their attention and so on, and they achieved success. So as you can see, the Ukrainian tactic is to focus on some territory, on some goal, and to do everything to attack at the same point while this point collapses. So this is the tactic of Ukrainians. If we're talking about the Russians, they have completely different tactic. The Russians, they can't act as Ukrainians. They can't, let's say, accumulate a lot of forces in Zaporozhye and after that to start like grand offensive operation in Zaporozhye. And the main reason why the Russians can't do this is that because all their movements can be spotted from the satellites. The Western countries, the NATO countries, the Ukraine, they know everything what the Russians do. They know all their movements, all their forces, all their ammo depot and so on. They know everything. So if the Russians shows the Western countries about some accumulation of the forces near this or that town, the Western countries and NATO will understand these plans and they will move their forces in this direction. So, and of course, to attack a wall, it's a very difficult thing with that, and as a result of these attacks, these types of attacks, the Russians might have a lot of losses. So this is the reason why the Russians need to stretch their plans. They need to attack all over the borders, all over the front lines, and with help of these tactics, the Western countries, the NATO countries, they don't have real understanding and idea what the Russians are planning to do. They can build a lot of protocols, a lot of like projections, what to do in this or that case or something like this. But if we're talking about the current situation, if you know, the Russians were trying to develop their bridgehead all over the front line, let's say starting from Ugledar and somewhere at Kupyansk area. And now the situation is as follows. As I told you, the Russians are trying to develop their offensive operation in direction of Marinka. And in the next 2 weeks, the Russians, according to their plans, are planning to take control over this area. We know that the Russians have some certain plans over Ugledar. These days, we haven't seen any actions, any activity in this area. But anyway, they try to do something. There are always clashes, heavy clashes, and so on. The Russians moves slowly, but their moves in direction of Novomikhailivka. And as you can see, let's say if the Russians are able to, and as you can see, all these movements they're doing at the same time. They're not concentrating all their forces near Ugledar and then they're pushing. They're not concentrating all their forces near Marinka and then they're pushing. They have some certain groups of forces all over the front lines and they pushes on every single point on this front line. Furthermore, if we're talking about Vadiana Avdiivka, the Russians tries to develop their offensive operation in Nivolska in direction of, let's say, Peski, Peromaiska, Vadiana. It's the same direction, let's say, to the north, like in direction of Toninka, so this area. If we're talking about Avdiivka, the Russians tries to develop their offensive operation in direction of Krasnogorovka. Every single day they make some kind of small attacks, trying to understand where is the weak position and something like this. If we're talking about, let's say, New York, Toretsk agglomeration, the Russians tries to develop their offensive operation. Let's mark like a global arrows in this area. So as you can see, and step by step, day by day, they achieve some small local success on this front line as well. If we're talking about Bakhmut, the Russians tries to develop their offensive operation, and we have an icon showing the real Russian progress that they're trying to move like this in this direction. If we're talking about, let's say, Liman, the Russians decided to return their control or to move in direction of Liman and the most important direction of Yampol. These towns. So as you can see, by the things that the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation all over this wall, all over the front line, at some certain point of time, let's say in a week or in a 2 or in a 3, there are a lot of risk to create for the Ukrainians that the Russians will be able to create at least 5, 6, 7 small cauldrons. If the Russians take control over Marinka and develop to penetrate the Ukrainians in this area, and if they're able to do the same in Nivolska, that will mean, let's say, operational encirclement of Krasnogorovka. If the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation in Marinka and to, let's say, penetrate defense orders near Ugledar, they will be able to encircle or to create operational encirclement of Novomikhailivka group, of this entire group. If the Russians are able to, let's say, develop their offensive operation in the direction of Vodyane, Toninka, and at the same time in Krasnogorovka, they will be able to encircle or to create operational encirclement of Avdiivka. Let's move next. If the Russians are able to take control over Druzhba, Dylivka, Dachna, over this area, and with, let's say, another attempts of attack in direction of New York, that we discussed this operation many times, they will be able to create some kind of operational encirclement of New York agglomeration. If the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation in direction of Klishchevka, and to establish fire control over Ivanovska, and the same situation if they are able to penetrate or to get control over Podgorodne, over Solidar, they will be able to create, let's say, operational encirclement of Bakhmut, of this area. If the Russians are able to attack in direction of Solidar, in direction of this town like Rozovka, and at the same time to return control over Yampol and Liman, they will be able to establish encirclement of Seversk. And as you can see, we have calculated right now just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible operational encirclement that might turn into cauldrons on the front line. And this is the Russian tactics. And you never know where it will be where the Russians will be able to break the situation. And of course, they are able to break the situation all over the front line. And this is the worst scenario for the Ukrainians. They can penetrate and to break the situation over some part of the front line. And of course, this is the best solution for the Ukrainians. It's normal solution for the Ukrainians. And of course, the best one if the Russians will reduce their forces all over the front line as much as possible. But I believe that the Russians at some point of time during the next 3 weeks, we might see the entire collapse of the entire front line. Because it's not a big deal, to tell the truth. Marinka is almost completely taken by the Russians. They have initiative in this area, and sooner or later they will push the Ukrainians from this area. If we're talking about Novoiska this day, they are storming this area. It's not a big deal. I believe it's also a question. It's not a question if the Russians are able to take. It's just a question of time. If we're talking about Peromaiska, Vodyane, it's also just a question of time when the Russians will be able to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible there. About Avdiivka, there are a lot of questions. I am not so sure about Avdiivka as I'm so sure about the towns near Donetsk. And about New York, there are still no operation in direction of New York agglomeration, but anyway, it's possible to create something. If we're talking about Bakhmut, there are very heavy clashes, and I believe that anyway both sides will lose soldiers in this area. So for now, it's possible to create something there, but it will be very difficult. The Russians just got control over this area, and I believe it's just a matter of question when the Russians will start storming or bombing Rozovka. And the same story all over the front line. It's just a matter of time when the Russians will be able to push the Ukrainians for 10 or 15 kilometers, and these 10 kilometers might become critical for the Ukrainians, and the entire front line can be collapsed. So very interesting, and let's follow this situation together. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.